Between the summer of 1942 and the winter of 1943, a titanic struggle took place on the banks of the Volga River. This battle became a turning point of the Second World War. Brutal, decisive, and devastating. This is a quick run-through of the Battle of Stalingrad. By mid-1942, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union had failed to achieve the decisive victory Hitler had expected in 1941. Instead of concentrating on Moscow, Hitler now turned his attention south. The German summer offensive of 1942, known as Case Blue, was aimed primarily at the oil fields of the Caucasus. Germany desperately needed fuel to continue the war. The offensive divided the German advance into two main directions. Army Group A drove toward the Caucasus oil fields, while Army Group B advanced toward the Don and Volga, with Stalingrad becoming a major objective. Stalingrad, a major industrial city on the Volga, was valuable both symbolically and strategically. Controlling it threatened Soviet transport along the river and helped protect the northern flank of the German advance into the Caucasus. And there was another reason the city mattered to Hitler. It carried the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Capturing it would therefore have enormous propaganda value. But the further the German armies advanced, the more difficult their position became. Their supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across the steppe. Fuel and ammunition were increasingly difficult to deliver, while German forces were spread across an enormous front. The German commander responsible for the Stalingrad sector was General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the German Sixth Army. The Soviet leadership was determined to hold the city, and Stalin made clear that Stalingrad had to be defended. Reinforcements were rushed across the Volga, often at night and under German air attack. The river became a vital lifeline. Soldiers, ammunition, and equipment crossed from the eastern bank into the shattered city, while wounded men and civilians were carried back in the opposite direction. The battle began in July 1942, but by late August the fighting had reached the city itself. The Luftwaffe subjected Stalingrad to enormous bombardments, destroying large parts of the city. But the destruction created a problem for the attackers. The ruins became defensive positions. Streets, factories, railway yards, cellars, and piles of rubble could all be turned into strong points. The German army had built its reputation on speed, mobility, and combined arms warfare. But inside Stalingrad, those advantages became much harder to exploit. The battle increasingly became a struggle for individual buildings and rooms. The grain elevator became the scene of fierce fighting. The huge factories of Stalingrad, including the Red October and Barricade works, became fortified battlefields. At places such as Mamayev Kurgan, control of a single hill could determine who could observe and fire upon large sections of the city. Soviet soldiers fought in small groups, often only meters away from German positions. The commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, General Vasily Chuikov, understood that the closer his troops stayed to the Germans, the more difficult it would be for German artillery and aircraft to support their own forces without risking friendly fire. The result was a battle of extraordinary closeness and brutality. German soldiers who had expected a relatively quick victory became trapped in a grinding battle of attrition. By October, German forces controlled most of Stalingrad, but Soviet troops still held narrow positions along the Volga. Reinforcements continued to cross the river, allowing the defenders to cling to their remaining footholds. The Germans were capturing more and more of the city, but they were paying an enormous price for every advance. And while the fighting consumed the Sixth Army inside the city, the Soviets were preparing something much larger. In November 1942, Soviet commanders Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky helped organize a massive counteroffensive. The plan was not simply to attack Stalingrad. Instead, Soviet forces would strike the weaker Axis armies protecting the German flanks. On November 19th, Operation Uranus began. Soviet forces attacked from north and south of Stalingrad, breaking through the Romanian positions defending the German flanks. The German Sixth Army was still heavily committed inside the city and had few mobile reserves available to respond effectively. Soviet armoured forces then drove deep into the German rear. On November 23rd, Soviet forces met near Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army and other Axis formations were now surrounded. Around 250,000 Axis troops were now trapped in the Stalingrad pocket. Hitler refused to allow Paulus to withdraw. Instead, he ordered the army to hold its ground and promised that the Luftwaffe could keep it supplied from the air, but the airlift could never deliver enough supplies to meet the needs of the trapped army. Food, ammunition, and fuel became desperately scarce. The German soldiers faced freezing temperatures, disease, starvation, and constant Soviet attacks. A German attempt to relieve the pocket, Operation Winter Storm, reached within striking distance but failed to break through to Paulus's army. The opportunity for a German breakout was effectively lost. Into January 1943, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Soviet forces reduced the size of the pocket and began a final offensive. On January 31st, Paulus surrendered his headquarters. Hitler had promoted him to field marshal only one day earlier, apparently expecting that Paulus would follow the tradition of a German field marshal and take his own life rather than surrender. But Paulus refused. Fighting continued elsewhere in the pocket. On February 2nd, 1943, the last organized German resistance at Stalingrad ended. The human toll was staggering. Estimates vary depending on how casualties are counted, but hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, captured, or went missing during the campaign. Around 91,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner at the end of the battle, and relatively few would ever return home. Large numbers of civilians also died. Entire neighborhoods had been destroyed while survivors faced starvation, disease, and homelessness. Civilians who remained in the city were caught between bombardment, street fighting, hunger, and disease. Stalingrad had become one of the most destructive battles in human history. So why did it matter? Militarily, Stalingrad was a catastrophic defeat for Germany. The German Sixth Army had been destroyed as an effective fighting force, and German forces were forced into a wider retreat. The defeat also contributed to the evacuation of German forces from the Caucasus, as the danger of being cut off increased. More importantly, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front was increasingly shifting toward the Soviet Union. The Red Army would still suffer enormous casualties and face further difficult battles, including the German offensive at Kursk in 1943. But Stalingrad marked a major shift in the balance of power, and Soviet forces increasingly seized the strategic initiative. Politically and psychologically, Stalingrad had enormous impact. For the Soviet Union, it became a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. For Germany, it shattered much of the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Wehrmacht. But Stalingrad did not mean that Germany was immediately defeated. The war would continue for more than 2 years, and Germany still possessed substantial military power. What Stalingrad demonstrated was something more important. Germany could be defeated on the Eastern Front, and the Soviet Union had the strength to recover from enormous losses and take the initiative. Stalingrad therefore stands as a warning about the dangers of overreach, stretched supply lines, and strategic objectives that become increasingly disconnected from military reality. Above all, it remains a human story of endurance and tragedy, of soldiers and civilians caught in the maelstrom of modern industrial war. The Battle of Stalingrad was not simply a battle for a city. It was a battle that helped change the direction of the Second World War. If you enjoyed this history of the Battle of Stalingrad, please like and subscribe for more concise history explainers. Let us know in the comments if there is anything you would have included in this brief summary of the battle.